Ethan found the mare collapsed in the rejection pen after the auction, her shattered leg so badly damaged that the kill buyer refused to even waste a bullet on her. What this 12-year-old boy built in his backyard with $47 and his own two hands would bring an entire town to stunned silence. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun had barely crested over the rolling hills of Cedar Creek when 12-year-old Ethan Miller climbed out of his grandmother's old pickup truck, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The county livestock auction was a place he knew well, a sprawling maze of pens and corrals where the fates of countless animals were decided by the rise and fall of numbered paddles. His grandmother Martha had brought him here many times before, usually to sell the occasional calf or pick up feed supplies, but today felt different. There was something in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press against his chest as they walked through the dusty grounds. Ethan had always possessed a peculiar sensitivity to animals, a gift his grandmother called it, though his father had dismissed it as nothing more than a boy's overactive imagination. He could sense their fear, their pain, their hope. It was a connection that defied explanation, one that had drawn him to this life on the small family farm nestled in the heart of rural Kentucky. As they passed the main auction building, Ethan's attention was captured by a commotion near the back pens, an area reserved for animals deemed too damaged or worthless to parade before the bidding crowd. The rejection pen, the locals called it, where creatures waited for a fate that rarely involved second chances. What Ethan saw there stopped him cold. Standing in the corner of the muddy enclosure was a chestnut mare, her coat matted and dull, her ribs visible even from a distance. But it was her front left leg that made his heart sink. The limb hung at an unnatural angle, barely touching the ground as she shifted her weight to the other three legs. Her eyes, large and brown and filled with an ancient sadness, met his across the space between them, and in that moment, something passed between boy and horse that neither could have explained. It was recognition, understanding, and perhaps, just perhaps, a whisper of hope. His grandmother appeared at his side, her weathered face softening as she followed his gaze. "That poor thing," she murmured, shaking her head slowly. "Looks like she took a bad fall during the show circuit. I heard the owner talking to one of the handlers earlier. Says she's worthless now, too expensive to fix. They're just waiting for the kill buyer to make his rounds." Ethan felt something ignite within him, a fierce and sudden determination that surprised even himself. He had seen animals suffer before, had witnessed the harsh realities of farm life that his peers in town could never understand. But this was different. This horse was calling to him, silently begging for a chance that no one else seemed willing to give. "How much would they take for her?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. His grandmother looked at him with those knowing eyes that seemed to see right through to his soul. "Ethan, honey, that horse needs surgery, rehabilitation, months of care. Even if they gave her away for free, we couldn't afford what it would take to fix that leg. The veterinary bills alone would bankrupt us." But the boy had already made up his mind. He had exactly $47 saved from his summer work, money he had been putting aside for a new bicycle. It seemed like nothing, a pittance compared to what a healthy show horse might fetch. Yet, as he approached the pen, something told him it might be enough for a creature that everyone else had already given up on. The auctioneer, a portly man named Douglas who had known Ethan's family for years, raised an eyebrow when the boy approached. "You interested in that lame mare, son? She ain't worth the trouble. Previous owner was some fancy trainer from Lexington. Had her racing until she broke down during a competition. Refused to pay for the surgery and just left her here. Shame, really. Heard she had good bloodlines." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his crumpled bills. "I have $47. Will that buy her?" Douglas stared at the money, then at the boy, then back at the money again. A long moment passed, and Ethan could see the conflict playing across the man's face. The kill buyer would pay more, everyone knew that. But there was something in this boy's eyes, a conviction that seemed to transcend his young years. "Son, that horse is probably gonna die anyway. You understand that, right? Even with care, Even with everything you could give her, she might not make it through the winter. Ethan nodded solemnly. I understand, sir, but she deserves a chance. Everyone deserves a chance. The auctioneer sighed heavily, removed his cap and scratched his balding head. He looked toward the mare, who had lifted her head as if sensing that her fate was being discussed. Something about the way she stood there, proud despite her pain, dignified despite her circumstance, seemed to move even this hardened man of commerce. $47 it is, he finally said, extending his hand to shake Ethan's. But don't come crying to me when this goes sideways, you hear? The boy nodded vigorously, his heart soaring with a joy he could barely contain. His grandmother, who had watched the entire exchange from a respectful distance, shook her head slowly, but there was a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. She had seen that same stubbornness in her late husband, in her son, and now in her grandson. It was the Miller way, she supposed, this refusal to accept the verdict of the world when their hearts told them otherwise. Loading the mare into the trailer was an ordeal that took nearly an hour. Every step on that damaged leg caused her visible pain, and more than once she stumbled, her great body trembling with the effort of staying upright. But Ethan stayed by her side throughout, murmuring words of encouragement, his hand never leaving her neck. He did not know what awaited them at home, did not know if his grandmother's small farm had the resources to save this broken creature. All he knew was that from this moment forward, her fate was tied to his. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The drive back to the Miller farm took them along winding country roads that Ethan had known his entire life, past fields of golden wheat and weathered barns that had stood for generations. But on this particular afternoon, the familiar landscape seemed different somehow, charged with a significance that the boy could feel in his bones. In the trailer behind them, the injured mare swayed gently with each turn, and every few minutes Ethan would twist in his seat to peer through the back window, making sure she was still standing, still breathing, still fighting. His grandmother drove in silence for most of the journey, her hand steady on the wheel, her expression unreadable. Martha Miller was not a woman given to sentimentality. Life on a farm had taught her hard lessons about attachment and loss, about the cruel mathematics of survival that sometimes demanded impossible choices. She had buried a husband, raised a son alone, and now found herself caring for a grandson whose mother had vanished years ago in search of a life that did not include the responsibilities of parenthood. Through it all, she had learned to guard her heart, to measure her affections carefully against the realities of their circumstances. But watching Ethan with that horse, seeing the way his eyes had lit up with purpose, she found herself unable to deliver the lecture she knew she should give. The boy had lost so much already. His father worked long hours at the factory in town, coming home exhausted and hollow-eyed, rarely present even when he was physically there. Ethan had grown up in the spaces between, finding his companionship among the animals of the farm, his education in the rhythms of nature rather than the company of other children. If this broken mare could give him something to believe in, who was she to take that away? When they finally pulled into the dirt driveway of the farm, the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The property was modest by any standard, a weathered farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a small barn that had seen better decades, and a few acres of pasture bordered by ancient oak trees. It was not much, but it was home, and as Ethan jumped down from the truck, he felt a surge of determination that seemed to straighten his spine and square his shoulders. This would be her home now too, and he would make it worthy of her. Getting the mare out of the trailer proved even more challenging than loading her had been. The journey had exhausted what little strength she possessed, and her injured leg had stiffened during the ride. She stood at the trailer's edge, looking down at the ground below with eyes that seemed to calculate the impossibility of the descent. Ethan climbed up beside her, ignoring his grandmother's warnings to be careful, and placed his hand gently on her neck. He could feel her rapid heartbeat beneath his palm, could sense the fear that gripped her magnificent but damaged body. "I know you are scared," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "I am scared too, but we are going to do this together, okay? One step at a time. That is all we have to do. Just one step." As if understanding his words, the mare took a shuddering breath and lowered her head. Then, with an effort that seemed to cost her everything she had, she stepped down from the trailer. Her injured leg buckled slightly upon impact, and for a terrible moment Ethan thought she would fall. But she caught herself, redistributed her weight, and stood trembling but upright in the fading light. His grandmother had prepared a stall in the barn while they were unloading, filling it with fresh straw and hanging a bucket of clean water within easy reach. She had also called Doc Henderson, the local veterinarian who had been treating animals in these parts for over 40 years. He was not a fancy specialist from the city, but he knew horses, knew the land, and more importantly, knew the limitations of what was possible on a small family farm with limited resources. The old veterinarian arrived just as the sun was setting, his battered pickup truck rattling down the driveway with the distinctive sound that every animal in the county had learned to recognize. He was a tall man, thin as a fence post, with hands that looked too large for his body, but moved with surprising gentleness when examining his patients. Ethan watched anxiously as he inspected the mare's leg, probing carefully, noting her reactions to different pressures and movements. "Well, son," Doc Henderson finally said, straightening up with a series of pops from his aging spine, "you have got yourself quite a project here. This is a serious ligament injury, the kind that usually ends a horse's career and often its life. Professional treatment would involve surgery, months of stall rest, specialized rehabilitation equipment that costs more than most folks around here make in a year." He paused, looking at Ethan with eyes that held neither judgment nor false hope. The honest truth is, most people would not even try to save her. "But can she be saved?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the fear that churned in his stomach. "Is it possible?" The veterinarian was quiet for a long moment, studying the boy with the same careful attention he had given to the horse. He had known Ethan since the day he was born, had watched him grow from a silent, withdrawn child into a young man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders. There was something in this boy, a determination that reminded him of the old-timers who had settled this land, who had built something from nothing through sheer force of will. "Possible," he finally said, "is a tricky word. Medically speaking, the injury is severe but not necessarily fatal. The ligament is damaged, not completely torn. With the right support, the right care, and a whole lot of luck, there is a chance the leg could heal well enough for her to live a comfortable life. She would never race again, never compete, but she could walk, could run, could be a horse again. However," and here his voice took on a more serious tone, "this would require constant attention, specialized equipment, and a level of commitment that most grown adults would find overwhelming. You understand what I'm saying?" Ethan nodded slowly, his mind already racing with possibilities. He understood perfectly. What the veterinarian was telling him was that saving this horse would require a miracle, the kind that did not come from heaven but had to be built by human hands. That night, Ethan could not sleep. He lay in his narrow bed beneath the sloped ceiling of his attic room, staring at the wooden beams above him while his mind churned with the enormity of what he had undertaken. Through his window, he could see the barn where the mare now rested, a dark silhouette against the star-scattered sky. He had checked on her 3 times already since dinner, each visit confirming what he already knew in his heart. She was fighting, clinging to life with a tenacity that matched his own determination to save her. Sometime after midnight, he gave up on sleep entirely and crept downstairs to his grandmother's small library, a converted closet filled with books that had accumulated over 3 generations of Miller residents. Most were practical volumes about farming, animal husbandry, and rural medicine, the kind of knowledge that had kept families alive in these hills long before the internet made information accessible to anyone with a connection. He pulled out every book he could find about horses, about injuries, about rehabilitation, and carried them back to his room where he read by flashlight until his eyes burned. What he discovered was both discouraging and illuminating. The books confirmed what Doc Henderson had said. Ligament injuries in horses were notoriously difficult to treat, primarily because horses were not built to stay still. Unlike dogs or cats, who could be confined to crates during recovery, Horses needed to bear weight on their legs to maintain circulation and prevent a host of secondary complications. The challenge was finding a way to support the injured limb while still allowing enough movement to promote healing. Professional facilities used elaborate sling systems that could cost tens of thousands of dollars, mechanical contraptions that were far beyond anything the Miller farm could afford. But as Ethan read deeper into the older texts, books written in eras before modern veterinary medicine had developed such sophisticated solutions, he began to find something else. Stories of farmers and horsemen who had faced similar challenges and improvised their own methods of treatment. Accounts of homemade supports and rehabilitation devices cobbled together from whatever materials were available. These were not elegant solutions, not the kind of equipment that would grace the pages of a veterinary journal, but they had worked. They had saved horses that everyone else had given up on. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through his window, Ethan had filled an entire notebook with sketches and calculations. The central idea had come to him somewhere around 4 a.m, crystallizing from the various sources he had been reading into a vision that seemed almost tangible. What the mare needed was a support structure, a frame that would allow her to stand while taking weight off her injured leg. It would need to be adjustable, comfortable enough for extended use, and sturdy enough to handle the considerable forces that a 1,000-pound animal could generate. He knew exactly where he would build it. Behind the barn there was a flat area of packed earth where his grandfather had once kept equipment. It was sheltered from the wind by the barn on one side and a row of old cedar trees on the other, with enough space for the mare to move around once she began to recover. The location was perfect. Now he just needed the materials. His grandmother found him at the kitchen table that morning, surrounded by his notes and sketches, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but burning with an intensity that made her pause in the doorway. She had seen that look before, in her husband's eyes when he had decided to buy this farm against everyone's advice, in her son's eyes when he had announced he was marrying a woman everyone knew would break his heart. It was the Miller look, the expression that meant a decision had been made, and no force on earth would change it. "You have been up all night," she observed, moving to the stove to start the morning coffee. It was not a question. Ethan nodded, pushing his sketches toward her as she sat down across from him. "I figured out how to save her, Grandma. I know what I need to build. It is like a support frame, a kind of sling system that will hold her up while her leg heals. I found descriptions in your old books, and I have been adapting the designs to use materials we might actually be able to get." Martha studied the sketches with a practiced eye. She had grown up on this farm, had helped her father build fences and barns and 100 other structures that still stood decades later. She understood construction in her bones, could look at a plan and immediately see both its potential and its flaws. What she saw in her grandson's drawing surprised her. The design was rough, clearly the work of an amateur, but the fundamental concepts were sound. More importantly, they were achievable. "This main frame here," she said, pointing to the central structure in his sketch, "you are thinking wooden posts." Ethan nodded eagerly. 4x4s, sunk at least 2 feet into the ground for stability. Then cross beams at the top to support the sling mechanism. I was thinking we could use the old rope and pulley system from the hayloft, the one Grandpa installed years ago. It is still in good condition, and it would let us adjust the height and tension. For the next hour, grandmother and grandson sat together at that kitchen table, refining the design, solving problems, making lists of materials they would need. Martha found herself drawn into the project despite her reservations, her practical knowledge filling in the gaps that Ethan's enthusiasm could not bridge. She suggested reinforcements for the frame, alternative materials that might be salvaged from around the farm, solutions to structural challenges that the boy had not anticipated. By the time they finished their coffee, they had a workable plan. It would not be easy, and it would not be cheap, but it was possible. The realization seemed to settle over both of them simultaneously, bringing with it a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They were really going to do this. They were going to try to save a horse that everyone else had condemned, using nothing but their own hands and whatever resources they could scrape together. Ethan stood up from the table, his exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the surge of adrenaline that coursed through his veins. "I need to check on her first," he said, already moving toward the door. "Then I will start gathering materials." His grandmother watched him go, a small smile playing at the corners of her weathered lips. Whatever happened next, she thought, this boy was going to learn something about himself that no school could ever teach him. The mare had survived the night. Ethan found her standing in the corner of her stall, her weight distributed carefully across her 3 good legs, her injured limb barely touching the straw-covered ground. When he entered, she lifted her head and regarded him with those deep brown eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds of emotion. There was fear there, certainly, and pain that she could not hide despite her stoic demeanor. But there was something else too, something that looked almost like recognition, as if she remembered him from the auction and understood that he was the reason she was still alive. He had brought her fresh water and a handful of oats, simple offerings that felt inadequate given the magnitude of what he was asking her to endure. As she ate, he talked to her softly, telling her about the plan he had developed overnight, describing the structure he was going to build as if she could understand every word. Perhaps she could not comprehend the specifics, but she seemed to respond to the tone of his voice, the gentle cadence of hope that underlined everything he said. By the time he left the stall, something had shifted between them. She had a name now, one that had come to him in the quiet moments of the early morning. He would call her Grace, because that was what she needed, and what he hoped to give her. The work began that very morning. Ethan started by taking inventory of every usable piece of lumber, every length of rope, every nail and screw and bracket that the farm possessed. His grandfather had been a careful man, the kind who never threw anything away that it might someday prove useful, and this habit had left the barn and outbuildings filled with materials that had accumulated over decades. There were boards from old fences, posts that had been replaced but never discarded, hardware of every description stored in coffee cans and old jars. It was not much by professional standards, but to Ethan, it looked like treasure. The first challenge was the main support posts. His design called for 4 sturdy uprights, each at least 8 feet tall and strong enough to bear significant weight. He found what he needed in the back of the equipment shed, 4 oak posts that his grandfather had cut years ago for a project that never materialized. They were heavy, far too heavy for a 12-year-old boy to move alone, but Ethan was determined. He rigged up a crude dolly from an old wagon chassis, and inch by painstaking inch, dragged the first post out to his chosen building site. His grandmother watched from the kitchen window as he worked, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She had offered to help, but Ethan had politely declined, insisting that he needed to do this himself. She understood the impulse, even as she worried about its wisdom. There were lessons that could only be learned through struggle, truths that only revealed themselves through sweat and effort. If this project was going to mean anything, if it was going to transform her grandson in the ways she secretly hoped it might, he needed to feel the weight of it in his own muscles. By midday, Ethan had moved all 4 posts to the building site and begun the arduous task of digging the holes that would anchor them in place. The ground was hard, baked by the summer sun into something that felt closer to stone than soil. Each shovelful required enormous effort, and progress was measured in inches rather than feet. His hands, soft from a childhood spent more in books than in labor, quickly developed blisters that broke and bled. He wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt and kept digging. The first neighbor to notice the activity was old Mrs. Patterson, whose property bordered the Miller farm along the eastern fence line. She was a widow in her 70s, a woman whose curiosity about her neighbor's business was legendary throughout the county. She appeared at the fence around 2 in the afternoon, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her sharp eyes taking in the scene before her with undisguised interest. "That boy of yours is digging holes," she announced to Martha, who had come out to bring Ethan lunch. "Big ones, too. What is he building?" Martha explained the situation as briefly as she could, watching the older woman's face cycle through expressions of surprise, skepticism, and finally something that might have been admiration. "A lame horse," Mrs. Patterson repeated, shaking her head slowly. "And he thinks he can fix it himself? That is either the bravest thing I have ever heard or the most foolish. Maybe both." She paused, her eyes still fixed on the boy who continued to dig despite their conversation. "My Harold had a set of post-hole diggers in the shed when he passed. Good ones, not like those rusted things your grandson is using. I suppose they are not doing anyone any good just sitting there." The tools arrived within the hour, carried over by Mrs. Patterson's grandson who happened to be visiting. They made the work significantly easier, though easy was hardly the word Ethan would have used to describe any part of that afternoon. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western hills, he had finished only 2 of the 4 holes. His entire body ached with a weariness that seemed to penetrate to his very bones, and his hands throbbed with pain despite the makeshift bandages. But when he looked at what he had accomplished, at the 2 dark cavities in the earth that would soon hold the first posts of Grace's rehabilitation structure, he felt something that transcended the physical discomfort. He felt purpose. That evening, as he sat on the porch with his grandmother watching the stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky, Ethan allowed himself to imagine the future. He pictured Grace standing in the completed structure, her weight supported by the sling system while her legs slowly healed. He imagined the day when she would take her first steps without assistance, when she would run across the pasture with the wind in her mane, fully recovered and gloriously alive. It was a distant dream, separated from the present by countless hours of work and uncertainty, but it was enough to fuel his determination for whatever came next. His grandmother said nothing, but she reached over and squeezed his hand gently. In that simple gesture was everything she could not put into words: her pride in his effort, her fear for his disappointment, and her hope that somehow, against all odds, this broken boy might succeed in saving this broken horse. Word spread through Cedar Creek the way it always did in small towns, carried on the breath of casual conversations at the general store, passed between neighbors over fence lines, whispered in the pews before Sunday service began. By the end of the first week, it seemed that everyone in the county knew about the Miller boy and his impossible project. Reactions varied widely, as they always do when someone attempts something that defies conventional wisdom. Some shook their heads and predicted failure, citing the practical realities that made such an endeavor foolish. Others watched with quiet interest, curious to see how far determination could carry a child who refused to accept the limits that adults took for granted. Ethan paid little attention to the gossip. His world had narrowed to the dimensions of his task, bounded by the 4 corners of the building site and the walls of Grace's stall. Each morning he rose before dawn to check on the mare, to change her bandages and offer her food and water, to speak to her in the soft tones that had become their private language. Then he would walk to the construction site and resume his work, picking up whatever tool was needed and applying himself to the next challenge with a focus that bordered on obsession. The frame took shape slowly, each piece added only after careful measurement and consideration. The 4 main posts stood upright now, sunk deep into the earth and braced with diagonal supports that his grandmother had helped him calculate. Between them, he had installed the horizontal beams that would support the pulley system, checking and rechecking each connection to ensure it could bear the weight it would eventually need to hold. The structure was crude by any professional standard, the joints imperfect, the surfaces rough and unfinished, but it was solid, built with the kind of desperate care that comes when failure is not an option. The breakthrough came on the 9th day when Ethan was struggling to install the main crossbeam. The timber was too heavy for him to lift alone, and his grandmother's arthritis prevented her from providing the assistance he needed. He had tried propping it up with makeshift supports, had attempted to rig a lifting system using the ropes he had salvaged, but nothing worked. The beam sat on the ground, mocking his efforts, while the sun climbed higher and the morning slipped away into afternoon. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the problem with a mixture of frustration and exhaustion, when he heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Looking up, he saw not 1 but 3 pickup trucks pulling into the driveway, their beds loaded with lumber and tools and materials he could not immediately identify. The drivers emerged one by one, men he recognized from town, farmers and carpenters and general laborers who had heard about his project and decided, for reasons they might not have been able to articulate, that they wanted to help. Tom Hendricks was the first to reach him, a burly man in his 50s who had worked construction his entire adult life. His hands were calloused and scarred, his face weathered by decades of outdoor labor. But his eyes were kind as he surveyed the half-finished structure. "Not bad work for a kid," he said, nodding slowly. "But you are going to kill yourself trying to do this alone. We figured you could use some help." Ethan did not know what to say. He had not asked for assistance, had not expected anyone outside his immediate family to care about what he was trying to accomplish. The arrival of these men, their willingness to donate their time and expertise to his cause, overwhelmed him in ways he could not express. The work accelerated dramatically with the additional hands. Tom directed the effort with the easy authority of experience, assigning tasks based on each person's skills, solving problems that would have taken Ethan days to figure out on his own. The main crossbeam went up within the first hour, secured with proper hardware that one of the men had brought up from his own workshop. By the end of the afternoon, the basic frame was complete, standing solid and sturdy against the sky like a promise made manifest. But the volunteers brought more than just labor. They brought knowledge, practical wisdom accumulated over lifetimes of working with animals and building things that needed to last. Old Samuel Wright, who had been raising horses since before Ethan was born, offered advice about the sling design itself, suggesting modifications that would make it more comfortable for Grace and easier for Ethan to adjust. His suggestions led to a complete redesign of the support system, replacing Ethan's original concept with something far more sophisticated and effective. The padding was crucial, Samuel explained, sketching out his ideas in the dirt with a stick. A horse in a sling will be there for hours at a time, maybe days. If the pressure is not distributed properly, you will trade one injury for another. You need wide straps, soft materials, something that will hold her up without cutting into her flesh. He had brought old horse blankets and foam padding salvaged from discarded furniture, materials that would form the core of the support system. By the time the sun began to set on that remarkable day, the rehabilitation structure had transformed from a rough frame into something that actually looked capable of accomplishing its intended purpose. The pulley system was installed and tested, the sling mechanism assembled and adjusted, the entire apparatus checked and rechecked by men who understood what was at stake. Tom Hendricks stood back and surveyed their collective work, his arms crossed over his chest, a rare smile breaking across his weathered features. "It is not fancy," he admitted, "but it should do the job. That mare of yours is lucky to have someone willing to fight for her like this. Most people would have given up before they started." Ethan thanked each of the volunteers as they prepared to leave, his voice thick with emotion he struggled to contain. These men had given him something more valuable than their labor, more precious than the materials they had contributed. They had given him hope, tangible and real, a foundation upon which he could build his dreams for Grace. That night, standing before the completed structure with his grandmother at his side, Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle upon him. Tomorrow he would attempt to move Grace into the sling for the first time. Tomorrow he would discover whether all this effort, all this faith, would amount to anything at all. The morning arrived with a chill that hinted at the approaching autumn, a sharpness in the air that made Ethan's breath visible as he walked toward the barn. He had barely slept, his mind racing through every possible scenario, every way the day might unfold. The rehabilitation structure stood ready behind the barn, its wooden frame silhouetted against the pale gray sky like a monument to hope. Now came the true test, the moment when theory would meet reality, and he would discover whether his desperate gamble had any chance of success. Grace seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. When Ethan entered her stall, she lifted her head and watched him with unusual alertness, her ears pricked forward, her nostrils flaring slightly as if trying to read his intentions from the air itself. Over the past 10 days, a bond had formed between them, forged through the countless hours he had spent at her side, talking to her, caring for her, promising her a future that neither of them could be certain would come. She trusted him now, he could feel it, but trust alone would not make the next few hours any easier. Doc Henderson arrived shortly after sunrise, his ancient pickup truck announcing his presence with its familiar rattle and wheeze. He had agreed to supervise the transfer, to ensure that the process did not cause additional damage to Grace's already compromised leg. Behind him came Tom Hendricks and Samuel Wright, who had insisted on being present to help with any adjustments the structure might need. Even Mrs. Patterson appeared at the fence line, her curiosity apparently stronger than her desire to stay out of other people's business. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. They would lead Grace slowly from the barn to the rehabilitation structure, supporting her injured leg as much as possible along the way. Once she was positioned within the frame, they would carefully raise the sling beneath her, taking weight off her legs gradually until the pressure on the damaged limb was reduced to a level that would allow healing. It sounded straightforward when described in words, but Ethan knew that reality rarely cooperated with plans, especially when those plans involved a 1,000-pound animal in pain. Getting Grace out of the stall was the first challenge. She had grown accustomed to the confined space over the past days, had come to see it as a refuge from the uncertainty that surrounded her. When Ethan opened the door and gently urged her forward, she hesitated, her eyes wide with apprehension. He could feel her muscles trembling beneath his hand, could sense the fear that warred with her desire to trust him. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice steady despite the anxiety that churned in his own stomach. "We are going to take this nice and slow, one step at a time, just like before." The journey from the barn to the rehabilitation structure covered perhaps 50 yards, but it felt like miles. Grace moved with agonizing slowness, each step on her injured leg causing her to flinch despite the support that Ethan and Doc Henderson provided on either side. Twice she stopped completely, her body rigid with pain, and Ethan feared she would refuse to continue. But each time, after a moment of rest and a few soft words of encouragement, she gathered herself and pressed forward. Her courage in that short walk struck Ethan as something almost holy, a testament to the will to survive that burned within all living creatures. When they finally reached the structure, Grace balked at the entrance. The frame rose above her like a cage, its wooden posts and crossbeams creating a space that must have seemed confining to an animal accustomed to open pastures. She snorted nervously, her head tossing from side to side as she tried to make sense of this strange construction. Ethan stepped inside first, positioning himself at the far end, where she could see him clearly. "Come on, Grace," he called softly, extending his hand toward her. "It is safe. I promise you, it is safe." The mare stood motionless for a long moment, her intelligent eyes studying the structure, evaluating the risk. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to square her shoulders with resolve, she stepped inside. The watching adults released a collective sigh of relief that they had not realized they were holding. The hardest part was over, or so they thought. Positioning the sling proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The apparatus needed to pass beneath Grace's belly and attach to the overhead pulleys at precisely the right points to distribute her weight evenly. Samuel Wright had designed it based on his decades of experience with horses, but Grace was larger than he had estimated, and the straps needed to be adjusted multiple times before they fit properly. Through it all, the mare stood with remarkable patience, as if understanding that these strange manipulations were somehow meant to help her. When everything was finally in place, Doc Henderson gave the signal to begin raising the sling. Tom Hendricks operated the pulley system, drawing the ropes through the mechanism with slow, careful movements. Inch by inch, the sling tightened beneath Grace, gradually taking on more of her weight. Ethan watched her face intently, looking for any sign of distress, ready to call a halt at the first indication of pain. But Grace remained calm, her eyes fixed on the boy who had brought her to this moment. The transformation was subtle at first, then suddenly unmistakable. As the sling lifted and the pressure on her injured leg decreased, Grace's entire posture changed. The tension that had gripped her body for days began to ease, her muscles relaxing as the constant pain diminished. She shifted experimentally, testing the support, discovering that she could stand without bearing weight on the damaged limb. A soft sound escaped her, not quite a whinny, but something closer to a sigh, an exhalation of relief that seemed to carry away some portion of her suffering. Doc Henderson moved forward to examine the leg, now hanging slightly above the ground, freed from the burden it had been forced to carry. "The swelling is already less than I expected," he announced, genuine surprise evident in his voice. "This contraption of yours might actually work." Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes but refused to let them fall. This was not the time for emotion. This was only the beginning, the first step on a journey that would take months to complete. But in that moment, watching Grace stand comfortably in the structure he had built with his own hands, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that became the heartbeat of Ethan's existence. Each morning he rose before the sun, made his way to the rehabilitation structure, and spent the first hours of daylight caring for Grace. He would check the sling's positioning, adjust the straps if needed, examine her injured leg for any signs of change. Then he would talk to her, sharing his thoughts and dreams as if she were the closest friend he had ever known. In many ways she was. The routine of rehabilitation was demanding in ways Ethan had not anticipated. Grace could not remain in the sling continuously, as prolonged suspension could cause its own set of problems. Doc Henderson had explained that she needed periods of supported standing alternated with careful rest, a schedule that required constant monitoring and adjustment. Ethan kept a notebook where he recorded everything: the hours she spent in the sling, her appetite, her mood, any changes in the appearance of her leg. The pages filled quickly with his careful handwriting, a chronicle of recovery measured in increments almost too small to perceive. Progress came slowly, so slowly that there were days when Ethan wondered if he was fooling himself. The swelling in Grace's leg diminished by fractions of inches, improvements that required careful measurement to detect. Her willingness to put weight on the injured limb increased gradually, from complete avoidance to tentative touches to brief moments of actual standing. Each small advancement felt like a victory, a confirmation that the effort was not wasted, but the distance still to travel seemed impossibly vast. School began again in early September, pulling Ethan away from his vigil for hours each day. He resented every minute spent in the classroom, his mind perpetually wandering to the mare waiting for him at home. His teachers noticed his distraction, his grades suffered, and more than one concerned adult suggested that perhaps he was too invested in this project, that he needed to prepare himself for the possibility of failure. He listened politely to their advice and ignored it completely. The other students were less subtle in their opinions. Word of his unusual undertaking had spread through the school, and reactions ranged from curious admiration to outright mockery. Some of his classmates thought him noble for trying to save the injured horse. Others considered him a fool wasting his time on a lost cause. A few, the cruel ones who exist in every school, took pleasure in predicting Grace's death, in describing in graphic detail what would happen when his precious project inevitably failed. Ethan endured their taunts in silence, drawing strength from a source they could not understand. At home, the community support that had materialized during construction continued in smaller but no less meaningful ways. Mrs. Patterson brought over vegetables from her garden, claiming she had grown more than she could use. Tom Hendricks stopped by regularly to check on the structure, making minor repairs and adjustments that kept it functioning properly. Samuel Wright visited weekly to assess Grace's progress, offering advice drawn from his lifetime of experience with the horses. Even people Ethan barely knew would appear occasionally, leaving supplies or simply offering words of encouragement before continuing on their way. His grandmother watched these interactions with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. She had lived in Cedar Creek her entire life, had known these people through good times and bad, but she had never seen anything quite like the response Ethan's project had generated. It was as if the boy's determination had awakened something in the community, a recognition of values that had perhaps been dormant but never truly forgotten. In fighting for Grace, Ethan had reminded them all of what it meant to refuse surrender, to stand against the odds when everything practical argued for giving up. The real breakthrough came in early October, on a morning so crisp and golden that it seemed painted by an artist's hand. Ethan had arrived at the rehabilitation structure at his usual early hour, expecting nothing more than another day of incremental progress. But when he approached Grace, he noticed something different in her posture, an alertness that had been absent in recent weeks. Her ears were pricked forward, her eyes bright with an energy he had not seen since the day he first found her at the auction. He watched in astonishment as she shifted her weight experimentally, moving more of it onto her injured leg than she ever had before. There was no flinch of pain, no immediate retreat to the safety of the sling's support. Instead, she stood balanced on all four legs for the first time in months, bearing her own weight with a steadiness that seemed almost miraculous. The moment lasted only seconds before she adjusted back to her supported position, but those seconds changed everything. Ethan ran to the house, his voice cracking as he shouted for his grandmother to come see. Together they stood before the structure, watching Grace repeat the experiment several times, each attempt lasting a little longer than the one before. Martha Miller, who had learned long ago to guard her emotions against the disappointments that life so often delivered, found tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She said nothing, could say nothing, but her hand found her grandson's and squeezed with a force that conveyed everything words could not express. Doc Henderson confirmed what they had witnessed when he arrived for his weekly examination. "The healing is progressing better than I would have believed possible," he admitted, shaking his head slowly as he ran his hands along Grace's leg. "The tissue is regenerating. The inflammation is almost completely resolved. At this rate, she might actually make a full recovery." He paused, looking at Ethan with an expression that mixed professional assessment with something approaching awe. "I have been practicing veterinary medicine for over 40 years, son. I have seen a lot of things in that time, but I have never seen anything quite like this." That night, Ethan sat beside Grace in the structure, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky above. The mare stood quietly, occasionally lowering her head to nuzzle his hair or shoulder, her breath warm against his skin. They had come so far together, had traveled a road that most had believed led nowhere. But the destination was finally coming into view, shimmering on the horizon like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The weeks that followed were marked by steady, almost miraculous improvement. Grace grew stronger with each passing day, her injured leg healing in ways that defied the pessimistic predictions that had surrounded her from the beginning. The time she spent in the sling decreased gradually, replaced by supervised walking sessions that Ethan conducted with meticulous care. At first, these walks covered only a few yards, short excursions within the confines of the rehabilitation area. But as October gave way to November, the distances increased, and soon Grace was walking the entire perimeter of the small pasture behind the barn. Ethan documented everything in his growing collection of notebooks, pages filled with observations and measurements that charted the course of recovery with scientific precision. He had become something of an expert on equine rehabilitation, absorbing knowledge from books and from the practical wisdom of people like Samuel Wright and Doc Henderson. His understanding of horse anatomy, of the mechanics of healing, of the patience required to nurse a damaged creature back to health, had expanded far beyond what anyone might have expected from a boy his age. The project had educated him in ways that no classroom ever could. The transformation in Grace was matched by a transformation in Ethan himself. The quiet, withdrawn boy who had bid $47 for a lame horse at the county auction had grown into something different, something more. His shoulders seemed broader now, his gaze more direct, his voice carrying a confidence that had been absent before. The other children at school noticed the change, and the mockery that had followed him in September gradually faded, replaced by a grudging respect that some were too proud to express openly but could not entirely conceal. His father noticed too. James Miller had spent years retreating into the numbing routine of factory work, using exhaustion as a shield against the grief and disappointment that had accumulated in his life. He had watched his son from a distance, present in body but absent in spirit, unable to bridge the gap that had opened between them after Ethan's mother left. But the project with Grace had penetrated even his defenses, awakening something that had lain dormant for too long. One evening in mid-November, James came home from work, and instead of retreating to the television as he usually did, he walked out to the rehabilitation structure where Ethan was conducting Grace's evening walking session. He stood at the fence for a long moment, watching his son guide the mare through her exercises with a gentleness that seemed almost supernatural. The boy moved in perfect harmony with the horse, anticipating her needs, responding to her subtle communications, connected in a way that transcended the ordinary relationship between human and animal. "She looks good," James finally said, his voice rough from disuse. Ethan turned, surprise evident on his face. His father rarely ventured out to this part of the property, had shown little interest in the project beyond occasional grunts of acknowledgement when progress was reported at the dinner table. To see him here now, actually engaging with what had consumed Ethan's life for months, felt almost surreal. "She is getting stronger every day," Ethan replied carefully, uncertain how to navigate this unexpected interaction. "Doc Henderson thinks she might be able to run again by spring. Not race or anything like that, but run. Actually run." Father and son stood in silence for a moment, the space between them filled with years of unspoken words and unexpressed emotions. James cleared his throat awkwardly, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his work jacket. "Your grandfather would have been proud of you," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "He always said that the measure of a person was not what they did when things were easy, but how they responded when everything seemed impossible." He paused, his eyes glistening in the fading light. "I should have told you that before. I should have told you a lot of things." Ethan did not know how to respond. The wall between them had stood for so long that he had almost forgotten there had ever been anything else. But something in his father's voice, a vulnerability that he had never heard before, suggested that perhaps the wall was not as permanent as he had believed. He nodded slowly, accepting the words as the peace and offering they were meant to be. From that evening forward, James began to participate in Grace's care. At first, his contributions were small, bringing water or helping to clean the rehabilitation structure. But gradually, he became more involved, learning the routines that Ethan had developed, understanding the purpose behind each exercise and treatment. Father and son worked side by side, their conversations initially awkward but growing easier with time. The horse that had brought them together became a bridge across the chasm that had separated them, her recovery paralleling the healing of wounds that had nothing to do with damaged ligaments. Thanksgiving arrived with its traditional feast, but this year the Miller household had more to celebrate than usual. Grace had graduated from the rehabilitation structure entirely, her legs strong enough now to support her weight without assistance. She still favored it slightly, probably would for the rest of her life, but she could walk without pain, could trot across the pasture with something approaching her former grace. The structure that Ethan had built stood empty now, a monument to what determination and love could accomplish when combined with enough faith. The holiday meal was larger than it had been in years, expanded to include some of those who had contributed to the project. Tom Hendricks sat at one end of the table, his rough hands looking strangely delicate holding Martha's fine china. Samuel Wright occupied the chair beside him, regaling everyone with stories of horses he had known throughout his long life. Even Mrs. Patterson had been invited, her sharp tongue softened by the occasion and perhaps by something more, a sense that she was part of something meaningful for the first time in years. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared away, Ethan slipped outside to check on Grace one final time before bed. She stood in the pasture, her chestnut coat gleaming in the moonlight, her head raised as if tasting the wind. When she saw him approach, she walked toward the fence to meet him, her gait smooth and steady, barely a trace of the limp that had once seemed destined to define her existence. He reached out to stroke her neck, marveling at how far they had come together. Winter arrived with a ferocity that seemed determined to test everything Ethan had built. December brought snow that blanketed Cedar Creek in white, transforming the familiar landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. The temperatures plummeted, and the wind howled through the valley with a persistence that made even simple outdoor tasks feel like expeditions into hostile territory. But Grace thrived despite the cold, her recovery continuing unabated, her strength growing with each passing week until she was nearly unrecognizable as the broken creature Ethan had rescued from the auction grounds. The mare had developed a routine of her own, one that revolved around the boy who had saved her life. Each morning she would wait by the pasture fence, watching for him to emerge from the farmhouse, her breath creating small clouds into the frigid air. When he appeared, She would trot toward him with an eagerness that never failed to warm his heart, her movements fluid and confident despite the injury that had once threatened to end her life. They would walk together through the snow-covered fields, their footprints creating parallel trails that wound between the bare trees and frozen streams. News of Grace's remarkable recovery had spread far beyond the boundaries of Cedar Creek. Doc Henderson had mentioned the case to colleagues at a veterinary conference, and soon Ethan began receiving letters from people he had never met, horse owners and animal lovers who had heard the story and wanted to express their admiration. A reporter from the regional newspaper drove out to interview him, taking photographs of the rehabilitation structure and the mare who had defied all expectations. The article that resulted portrayed Ethan as something of a local hero, a boy whose refusal to accept the impossible had resulted in something that bordered on miraculous. The attention made Ethan uncomfortable in ways he struggled to articulate. He had not undertaken the project seeking recognition or praise. He had simply seen a creature in need and responded to an impulse that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The idea that his actions might be considered heroic seemed almost absurd to him. He had done what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less. The true hero of the story, as far as he was concerned, was Grace herself, who had endured months of pain and uncertainty with a dignity that humbled everyone who witnessed it. But the publicity had unexpected consequences that even Ethan could not dismiss. Donations began arriving at the Miller farm, contributions from strangers who had read about the project and wanted to help. Some sent money, modest amounts that nevertheless added up to something significant over time. Others sent supplies, feed and medical equipment, and winter blankets for the horse who had captured their imaginations. A retired veterinarian from 3 counties over drove out one weekend to offer his expertise, spending hours examining Grace and pronouncing her recovery one of the most complete he had ever seen from such a severe injury. The most surprising development came in late January when a letter arrived bearing the letterhead of the State Agricultural College. The institution was hosting its annual Youth Achievement Awards in the spring, and Ethan had been nominated for recognition in the category of Animal Husbandry and Care. The nomination had been submitted by Doc Henderson, who had taken it upon himself to document the project and present it to the selection committee. The letter invited Ethan to attend the ceremony in April, where he would receive a certificate of achievement and a modest scholarship toward future educational pursuits. His grandmother wept when she read the letter, tears of joy streaming down her weathered face as she pulled Ethan into an embrace that seemed to communicate years of pride and love. His father stood nearby, his expression complicated but unmistakably moved. The recognition validated something that the family had known all along, but had perhaps been afraid to fully believe. Ethan had accomplished something extraordinary, something that would follow him for the rest of his life as proof of what he was capable of achieving. The winter months passed slowly, but not unpleasantly, filled with the quiet routines of care and recovery. Grace continued to improve, her leg growing stronger until there was barely any trace of the injury that had nearly claimed her life. She ran now, actually ran, galloping across the snow-covered pasture with a joy that seemed to burst from every fiber of her being. Ethan would watch her from the fence, his heart swelling with an emotion he could not name, something beyond happiness, beyond satisfaction, something that felt almost sacred. Spring announced its arrival gradually, the snow retreating before the advancing warmth, the bare trees budding with new life, the frozen earth softening into mud that would eventually become green grass. The anniversary of Grace's rescue approached, marked on Ethan's calendar as a private holiday more meaningful than any that appeared on the official schedule. 1 year since he had stood before that muddy pen at the auction, 1 year since he had seen something in a broken mare's eyes that had changed the course of both their lives. The community of Cedar Creek had been transformed by the experience as well, though the changes were subtle enough that only careful observers might notice. People smiled more readily, offered help more freely, spoke to one another with a warmth that had perhaps always been present, but had needed awakening. The story of the boy and the horse had reminded them of something important, something about the power of compassion and the value of refusing to give up. In fighting for Grace, Ethan had given them all permission to believe in possibilities they had long since abandoned. On the morning of the anniversary, Ethan rose early and walked out to the pasture, where Grace waited for him, as she always did. The sun was rising over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed almost impossibly beautiful. He climbed the fence and dropped down beside her, running his hand along her neck, feeling the strong pulse of life beneath his palm. 1 year ago, everyone had said she would die. 1 year ago, everyone had said he was a fool for trying to save her. But here she stood, alive and healthy and whole, a testament to what love could accomplish when it refused to accept the verdict of the world. Tomorrow they would travel to the agricultural college for the award ceremony. Tomorrow he would stand before strangers and receive recognition for what he had done. But today, in this quiet moment, with the horse who had taught him more about courage than any human ever had, he needed nothing more than this. The auditorium at the State Agricultural College was larger than any indoor space Ethan had ever seen, its rows of seats stretching back into shadows that seemed to swallow the light from the stage. He sat in the front section reserved for award recipients, his grandmother on one side and his father on the other, both dressed in their Sunday best for the occasion. Behind them, filling an entire row, were the people who had helped make this moment possible. Tom Hendricks in a suit jacket that looked like it had not been worn in decades. Samuel Wright with his silver hair neatly combed. Mrs. Patterson dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had brought specifically for this purpose. Doc Henderson sitting straight and proud, his nomination having brought them all to this place. The ceremony proceeded through its various categories, each recipient climbing to the stage to receive their certificate and shake hands with the distinguished panel of judges. Ethan watched without really seeing, his mind elsewhere, back at the farm where Grace waited in her pasture. He had said goodbye to her that morning, promising to return before nightfall, and she had seemed to understand, nuzzling his cheek with a gentleness that still amazed him after all these months. When his name was finally called, Ethan rose on legs that felt strangely unsteady. The walk to the stage seemed to take forever, each step carrying him further from the anonymity he had always preferred, and deeper into a spotlight he had never sought. The faces in the audience blurred together, hundreds of strangers watching him cross the polished floor, waiting to see this boy they had heard so much about. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he feared he might stumble, might embarrass himself, and everyone who had come to support him. But then he reached the podium, and the woman presenting the award smiled at him with genuine warmth, and something inside him settled. She spoke about his project, describing the rehabilitation structure he had built and the recovery it had facilitated, using words like remarkable and inspiring and unprecedented. Ethan listened as if she were talking about someone else, some other boy who had done these incredible things. The certificate she handed him felt weightless in his hands, a piece of paper that somehow represented months of labor and worry and hope. They asked him to say a few words, and he approached the microphone with no idea what would come out. The audience waited in patient silence, and somewhere in that sea of faces he could see his grandmother wiping her eyes, his father sitting straighter than he had in years, the friends and neighbors who had believed in him when belief seemed foolish. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "A year ago, I bought a horse that everyone said was worthless," he started, his voice steadier than he expected. "She was injured and abandoned, and nobody thought she would survive. I did not know if I could save her either. I just knew I had to try." He paused, gathering his thoughts, aware that every eye in the room was fixed upon him. "The thing is, I thought I was rescuing her. I thought I was the one doing the saving. But somewhere along the way, I realized it was the other way around. Grace saved me just as much as I saved her. She taught me that giving up is a choice, and it is a choice we do not have to make. She taught me that love is not just a feeling but an action, something you do every single day, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. She taught me that broken things can heal if someone cares enough to give them the chance." The applause that followed his words was thunderous, rolling through the auditorium like a wave that lifted him up and carried him forward. People rose to their feet, strangers moved by a story that had touched something universal in their hearts. Ethan stood at the podium, overwhelmed by the response, by the realization that what had begun as a private act of compassion had somehow grown into something that resonated far beyond the boundaries of his small farm. The drive home that evening was quiet, each passenger lost in their own reflections on what had transpired. Ethan sat in the back seat of his father's truck, the certificate tucked carefully beside him, watching the familiar landscape roll past the window. The sun was setting by the time they reached Cedar Creek, painting the sky in the same golden hues that had greeted him on so many mornings with Grace. When they pulled into the driveway, Ethan saw that someone had been busy in their absence. A crowd had gathered in the pasture behind the barn, neighbors and friends and people he barely recognized, all standing around the rehabilitation structure that had been the birthplace of a miracle. Strings of lights had been hung from the posts, illuminating the wooden frame like a shrine, and there in the center, standing calm and beautiful, was Grace. He climbed out of the truck and walked toward her, the crowd parting to let him pass. She watched him approach with those deep brown eyes that had first captured his heart at the auction, eyes that now shone with health and contentment and something that looked remarkably like joy. When he reached her, she lowered her head and pressed her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her neck, and the world seemed to hold its breath around them. This is what it means to love something, Ethan thought as he stood there in the fading light, surrounded by the community that had helped him accomplish the impossible. This is what it means to refuse to give up. Grace had been abandoned and broken, discarded by people who saw no value in a creature that could no longer serve their purposes. But she had found her way to him, or perhaps he had found his way to her, and together they had proven that miracles were not supernatural events, but natural consequences of determined love. The structure he had built in his backyard had indeed shocked the whole town, but not because of its engineering or its ingenuity. It had shocked them because it reminded them of truths they had forgotten, possibilities they had dismissed, hopes they had abandoned. In saving one lame horse, a 12-year-old boy had shown an entire community what it meant to believe in something worth fighting for. And that, perhaps, was the greatest miracle of all. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking and sharing it with others. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought. And if you have not already, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story like this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey.